I don't quite know what to make of this BMW M2. Usually with any latest M car, there are songs of praises written, and each one of them end up being called as the latest and the greatest in the company's long list of performance cars. I'm not sure if the M2 is that. It is the latest undoubtedly, but is it the greatest? I'm not so sure. I've driven my fair share of BMW M's, but I've never, incidentally, driven two of its baby cars that have quite a following, the WION M and the first generation F87 M2. So when I went to pick this one up, I had a completely blank slate to work with. I sat down for a round of coffee with another journalist friend, and we ended up discussing the M2 among a lot of other random things, and we both said that the M2 looks a bit odd. What I mean is that it's a bit over-styled. I'm pretty sure that there is great harmony between form and function, and the designers were chasing the optimum balance of packaging and also aggression of design. But come on, this just does not work, and in any universe, this is not going to be called pretty at all. I've looked at the M2 from all possible angles and for a very long time, and then I waited, and then I looked at it again and again and again, just in the hope that it will grow on me. But it hasn't, not even a bit. If you look at the M2 from the side, especially when you're sitting low, you will notice that the rear end has a very silly, very stupid protruding end, and that is just a big eyesore. But thankfully, the interior is a completely different deal. There is a smart, updated BMW look in the cabin, signed off particularly by the single piece of this glass slab that is the infotainment screen. The other bits in the cabin are also quite good. The quality of the materials used is high, and everything feels pretty robust in here. I absolutely love the seats. Firstly, I think they look fantastic with this M color theme going on, and they're also fairly comfortable. But they could have been just slightly more supportive along the sides, but that's a small bargain that I can live with. Remarkably, the media unit that BMW India has brought in is not all bells and whistles. There is an option of choosing carbon bucket seats. They would have been slightly lighter, thinner, and more skeletal, which means the M2 would have been slightly lighter, there would have been slightly more space on the rear, and the driver would be able to feel the road slightly more. The rear seats, and I really did get in the back, are really only for very small humans. If you are a tallish person and if you were to try and sit in the back, and even if the front passenger was kind enough to allow your knee a little margin of freedom from the back of the front seat's frame, the tapering roofline would make sure that you would have to pay a visit to your chiropractor so that he could snap your neck back into position. Although the seat cushioning in the back is fine, it's just the lack of space that makes it a not very comfortable place to be. Features, well, you get what has become a basic inclusion in the connectivity suite, which is CarPlay and Android Auto. Then there is the other safety and driver assist systems like park distance control, cruise control, front collision warning, lane departure warning, head-up display, and stuff like that. It also gets things like a drift analyzer. It's a fun little thing which will make you giggle and go attempt after attempt at setting huge slides. We did not really do any slides, sadly. The public roads did not allow that to happen. But maybe when we get the car on a track, we will go smoking the rears in a very, very mental way. And now the main question that people will ask in excitement, expecting fireworks of an answer, because it is an M2. How's it to drive? See, the baby M cars have always borrowed some chassis components from their bigger siblings. This new G87 M2 takes in a lot of stuff from the current generation M3 and M4. It borrows the subframes from the M4, and all the suspension links and architecture is similar to the bigger M. is about 4 inches shorter than the M4 and only very slightly lighter. And that means it's a heavy car for its footprint, weighing in at about 1700 kilograms. And that does get highlighted when you get playful with the throttle. The setup feels very unlike a strong M car. If you have driven M cars in the past, you would have loved them for their inherent oversteery nature. This one does not feel that way. It feels a bit opposite, in fact. It feels like the front is pushing on instead of the rear stepping out on a whim. And that's where a lot of mental debate goes on, because it's a great thing from driving dynamics point of view, but also a little lame at the same time. It's great because of the approachability and the adjustability of the car on route inputs from the driver. For a big chunk of prospective buyers who are not going to drive at 910s or 1010s, it is the obedience of the chassis that will make them feel good about themselves for going around bends doing speeds that they would have mostly only imagined in their heads or achieved on gaming consoles. I remember the M4 being a proper weapon. There is a sense of innocent playfulness at half-throttle driving, while it becomes an absolute beast, over-revving its rears in smoke when applied with the full force of its engine. But there was always a sense of fluidity to it. It did not feel edgy at any time. I think because the M2 rides on the suspension from the M4, the combination of that in a short wheelbase format would have been far too extreme. So the chassis tuning guys at M increased the spring rate at the front and softened up the rear to give it a more balanced dynamic range favoring high-speed stability. As a result of that, the rear yields more mechanical grip as the car oscillates to maintain contact with the road underneath. The adaptive dampers help with the ride, and the M2 never really felt like it would bottom out even with 3 adults on board. But while the suspension does not feel aggressive and the ride is okay, the rest of the driving experience is surprisingly middle of the road. The M2 is best experienced in the default sport mode, or you can set your inputs in the M1 and the M2 preset buttons on the steering wheel. Speaking of the steering, when going about at low speeds, the off-center feel in the steering is non-existent. And as you start taking the engine towards its red line and go to serious speeds, it feels unnecessarily pointy. I guess it is also to do with the road surfacing. The tarmac leveling wasn't really the best, and the M2 felt nervous when applied with a heavy dose of throttle, and the wavy roads made it skip lanes. So yeah, it's a bit disconcerting, surely. I also think the amount of rubber that it drives on is just hilarious. There is so much section at the front that you will need to muscle the car into stepping out. The Pirelli P04 at the front are 275/35 on 19-inch rims, and the rears are 285/30 on 20 inches. That is just crazy in such a small car. And the S58 engine in the M2 is the same as the one in the M4. It only runs a slightly lower boost pressure to produce 460 horsepower and 550 Newton meters. All that is delivered to the rear wheels through an M differential working off a clutch pack. The engine features the M twin power turbo technology, which means it has 2 mono scroll turbochargers. One supplies compressed air to cylinders 1 to 3, and the other one feeds cylinders from 4 to 6. The car also gets an array of electromechanical systems. Brake-by-wire is one big element of it, and there is also a 10-stage traction control system. The M2 gets 2 transmission options. One is a ZF 8-speed automatic, and the other one is this, the 6-speed manual that we are driving. Typically, a manual gearbox in a performance car is the best recipe for maximum driving pleasure. It activates and works all your senses. It's what the enthusiasts have always wanted. The M2 stick shift experience is not as great as, say, Porsche's. The manual in the M2 feels a bit lacking in comparison. The shift action sometimes feels a bit rubbery and lacks clarity. It's a very good short throw box, no doubt about it. And the senses are heightened because, again, it is a manual and you are driving a nice, fast sports car. But is it as good as Porsche's manual gearbox? Not really. Now, because the engine is very strong in torque supply, BMW has geared the M2 slightly taller, and the second, third and fourth gears are very flexible in managing the power and building speeds through the revs. Any car with a huge amount of power has to contend with vague vibrations, and to counter that, M2 makes use of 3 strut braces in the engine bay, and there is also a shearing plate underneath the rear subframe. All of this contributes to a stretched dynamic capability because it isolates the vibrations and makes the car feel more settled. The steering, the suspension, the gearbox, they lack tactility that you want from a package like this. It's imperative that a car of this kind speaks to you, that you can feel it through the skin. But the M2 does not have that quality. It is bloody fast, no doubt about it, and it's great in parts. But as a sum of all the parts, it's just not quite there. In its current form, BMW has tried to make the M2 do a lot of things well to appeal to a wide set of people, and that's where it has gone a bit wrong. The 1M and the first generation of the M2 had a focus on singularity that made them absolutely great. This M2 is perhaps the final act, the last episode, if you will, of a powerful straight-six engine mated to a manual gearbox in a small sports car construction. It should have been better than what it is. It should have been memorable, but it's sadly not.